All right, so today's lesson is 10.3, operations with radical expressions. All right, we're going to be adding, subtracting, and multiplying radicals today. So here's a side note that this is very important. When adding, subtracting radical expressions, they have to have the same number in the radicand and it does not change. So for example, all right, let's go back to last year, what you learned in combining like terms. When I have 2x plus 3x, you see how they both have an x? That means they're like terms, so I'm able to add their coefficient, which I get 5x, and that's my answer. Okay, next, here, let's look at the number that's inside the radical. Okay, this number is inside the radicand. All right, so they both have a 5 inside the radical. That means I'm able to add the coefficients that's outside. So I get 2 plus 3, which gives me 5, and the number inside the radical stays the same. So I get 5 radical 5 as my final answer. So basically, when we're combining like terms, how do I know I have a like term? I have the same number inside the radical, and I just add the numbers outside. All right, so let's try some easy ones. All right, here's the first example. Okay, you see how all three terms have a 2 inside the radical? That means I'm able to add and combine the numbers outside. So if you want, I'm gonna just write radical 2, because that stays the same. So I'm gonna go 3 minus 5 gives me negative 2, plus 4 gives me a positive 2 as my final answer. Again, 3 minus 5 gives me a negative 2, plus 4 gives me a positive 2, radical 2. Let's do the next one, okay? Look how all three terms has a radical 11. So I'm gonna combine 6 plus 2, which is 8, minus 9 gives me a negative 1, radical 11 as my final answer. You don't need to put the 1, but if you want to, you can. So your final answer is negative 1, radical 11. Okay? All right. One more, and then we do a more challenging one. Okay? So I'm going to underline my like terms. So I'm going to look through my whole expression. I'm going to underline this one with this one. Okay? They both have a 5 inside the radical. So I get 4 plus 6 is 10, radical 5. Okay? Next, I'm going to double underline this one. Okay? I get negative 3 minus 4. They're both negative. That tells you that you're going to add to get a negative 7, and you leave the radicand the same. All right? Now, this is your final answer because these two terms have different numbers inside the radicand. So your final answer is 10 radical 5 minus 7 radical 6. So these are the easier ones because the radicals are already simplified, and all you have to look at is, do they have the same number inside the radical, so you're able to combine the coefficients outside. All right, so let's do a little bit more challenging questions. This is where the skill that you guys learned in 10.2, the last section that you guys were quizzed on last week, comes into play. All right, so let's look at the first example. 18, 32, and 72. They're not simplified. Okay, so your first step before you could even combine them, because they're not like terms, you can't combine them, you got to break them up. So I'm going to break them up how I taught you. Radical 9 times radical 2 plus 16 times 2 and 36 times 2. Okay, so now I'm going to circle all my perfect squares, and I'm going to take them out. So the square root of 9 is 3. I'm left with radical 2 plus 4 radical 2 plus 6 radical 2. Because the square root of 16 is 4. The square root of 36 is 6. So now look at your three terms. They all have a radical 2 inside. So I'm going to add my numbers that are outside. So I have 3 plus 4 is 7 plus 6. I'm left with 13 radical 2 as my final answer. Now, this is the work that I want to see for your classwork that I'm assigning, okay? Don't just give me answers. I need to see all the numbers broken up if you have to break it up. All right, let's do another one. All right, so here, I have numbers outside. That tells me once I break this up, I'm going to have to multiply to this number. So I'm going to leave the 4 outside, and I'm going to break up the 54. 9 times 6. 24, I'm going to break it up into 6 times 4. Okay? So I'm going to circle this one, and I'm going to circle this one. All right? So I have a 4 times, what's the square root of 9? 3. I'm left with radical 6. Plus, the square root of 4 gives you 2, and you have the 2 outside. So look how I'm writing it. Okay, I'm not skipping any steps. Now I'm going to multiply. 4 times 3 is 12 radical 6 plus 4 radical 6. They both have a radical 6 inside the radicand. That means I'm able to combine 12 plus 4 gives you 16 radical 6 as my final answer. Okay? All right, so let's go to C. I'm going to break up the 12 into 4 times 3. And I'm going to break up the 48 into 16 times 3. So then you circle the perfect squares. So I get 4 times 2 radical 3 minus 6 times 4 radical 3. Okay? Because square root of 4 is 2, square root of 16 is 4. Now I'm going to multiply 4 times 2 is 8 radical 3 minus 24 radical 3. They both have the same radicand. So 8 minus 24 gives me a negative 16 radical 3. Okay? So that is adding and subtracting radicals. All right? Now, the next step, the next skill that you're going to do is multiplying. Okay? So when we multiply, okay, you multiply the numbers that are outside together and the numbers that are inside the radicand together. So for example, I'm going to multiply 3 times negative 4, which gives me negative 12. Then I'm going to multiply 2 times 6, which is 12. Now, this is not your final answer because you could break up the 12. The 12 gives me 4 times 3, right? Circle this one, which gives me 2 times the negative 12 gives me negative 24 radical 3 as your final answer. So as you see, you are using the skills that we did last section. And you're applying it to this one. But we have more steps because now we're combining like terms. All right, last one. So I'm going to distribute. This means distributive property. So I'm going to multiply the two numbers that are outside. 3 times 2 is 6. Then I'm going to multiply the two numbers inside. That gives me radical 6 minus. Now I'm going to multiply 3 times 4, which is 12. And then 2 times 5, which gives me 10. All right. Now, this is your final answer because you can't break up the 6 anymore and you can't break up the 10 anymore. All right. So these are not like terms, so you can't combine them. And that's today's lesson. We're going to be spending the whole week on this lesson. All right. So if you're not understanding, just watch the video again. Ask me questions on the Zoom meeting that you might be having. And that's why this is very important that you do the classwork and you show your work. So then when I email you back, I could tell you, oh, this is what you're doing wrong.